Hello again. For our second day on waiting for Godot, I have just two main um, points that I want to discuss. And the first one is here. Here we have Pato and Lucky three performances, and then mostly the beginning or first part of Act Two, which I call Here We Go Again because it's very similar to the first act. All right, so about these three performances, usually I come to class and I say, okay, so what are the three performances at the end of Act One? And I asked this deliberately because over the years, it seems that, well, I mean, so obviously the Lucky's monologue is the most recognizable and most famous of the three. And then right before that, Lucky does a dance. Um, and so these two performances are done. Pato offers to have Lucky dance or recite or sing or think. And in the end, Didi and Gogo wound up asking if, well, can he dance and think? And Pato agrees and says, yes, it's the natural order, dance and then think. So So these two performances are pretty obvious, but there is a third performance that actually comes before this one, and it is by Pazzo. And I'll show you the script of it here. His speech is rather long, and it actually starts a little bit before this, but I didn't think I could fit it all in the slide. So, but on page 28, and again, he's doing this as a gift of sorts for Didi and Gogo, who have spent their time putting up with Pazzo and Lucky. So he says, "Is there anything I can do? Shall I tell you about the twilight?" I think is the way he's worded it. And then just at the bottom of page 28, he begins by saying, "Ah, yes, the night. But be a little more attentive for pity's sake. Otherwise, we'll never get anywhere." And then it says, "Look at the sky. Look." And then he tries to get Lucky and Didi and Gogo to look at the sky. And then this is where he picks up, "Ah, yes, the night. Um, uh, will you look at the sky, pig? Good, that's enough. Now." And um, so I won't read this entire thing, but before going any further, I wanted to point out the stage directions are very precise, all right? And this is what kind of contributing to this idea that this is a performance. There's a dramatic pause, and then we'll talk about that some more. But he's talking about the rising of the sun, the spending of the day, and the coming of the night. And um, and so, all right, so an hour ago, so the sun is in the sky during the day, and then it gradually grows paler and paler until finished it comes to rest. All right, so that's the twilight. And then, but behind this veil of gentleness and peace, night is charging, and will burst upon us, pop like that, just when we least expect it. That's how it is on this bitch of an earth. All right, so I think what's important here is that he's talking about the twilight and the coming of night, but he's using this as a metaphor for life. You know, life, it comes, we experience the day and light of our lives, and then the twilight comes, and then it's over. And when he says that's how it is on this bitch of an earth. So it's a metaphor, and it is a performance, and we know this in particular because immediately following his speech, he asks for his audience reaction. How did you find me? Good, fair, middling, poor, positively bad? Didi and Gogo are kind of puzzled because I'm not quite sure that they were thinking of this as a performance of sorts, but he's asking them for their evaluation. So it says, Vladimir, first to understand. Oh, very good, very good. And you, sir? And then, oh, Trey Bong, Trey Bong. This is kind of an inside joke. He's, Très bien is the French for very good. And so he's kind of, I don't know, making a joke out of pretending he's speaking French. So, but then Pasa comes back with, bless you, gentlemen, bless you. I have such need of encouragement. I weakened a little towards the end, didn't you? You didn't notice? Oh, perhaps just a teeny weeny little bit. I thought it was intentional. Right, so you see how the performance goes there. I mean, it is something that he is performing for them. And its significance really has to do with the fact that it is an articulation of the human condition. And so are the other two performances going to be. And we'll talk about those next. But here, this metaphor of life being like the course of a day and the coming of the night. It's kind of like a life's a bitch and then you die type of thing. Right after this, on page 31 of the text, is where the next performance happens. And this is Lucky's dance. And if you ever see this performed, usually it's really quite short. It's not really a dance at all. It's a couple of gestures, and Beckett actually intended it this way, just to be a couple of gestures, and then because after it's over, Estragon says, "Is that all?" And then Pato says, "Encore," so he does it again. So it's so really short and really not impressive at all. But I think that what is significant about this is that Pato asks Didi and Gogo about the dance. Do you know what he calls it? And they make silly guesses. But Pato says, the net. He thinks he's entangled in a net. All right, so just that little bit of a clue is so, and then when he does the dance, it does sort of look like he's kind of stuck in something. So this is yet another metaphor, if you will, for the human condition, that as human beings we're kind of stuck in this net of existence. The last and most impressive of the performances is, of course, Lucky's monologue. And, I don't know what you all made of it. I mean, it is kind of nonsensical. And I don't think, given the current context, I don't think we're going to spend a lot of time worrying about it. I mean, people have said many things about it. And I'll show you in a minute a quote from one Beckett critic's book that is an explanation that comes actually from Beckett himself. But if you look at the beginning of it, it does, given the existence as uttered forth in the public works of Puncher and Watman, of a personal God with white beard, outside time, without extension, who from the heights of divine apatheia, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so it does kind of begin by sounding like a statement that's trying to understand the existence of God. Does that makes sense, right? But mixed in with it is a lot of other stuff, like who's Puncher and Watman. These are made up names. And there's kind of a lot of bathroom humor too. There is a reference to another pair of people called Fartov and Belcher. I mean, you can see the sort of the bathroom humor in that, and also the Academy of Anthropopatry. Kaka and Popo are what the stuttering is kind of articulating there. So you have this juxtaposition of very high sounding things, like having to do with the existence of God and understanding reason and human life, with all these nonsensical things. And later on, he starts talking about tennis and cycling, and so when I do this with students in the classroom, I talk about, how do we understand a text that is opaque? You can't really even see through it. You can't, it doesn't seem to make any sense at all. But I usually start with things like, well, what are some of the things that are repeated? All right, so is there a pattern of some kind? And then, so if we look at certain phrases that are repeated several times in this, we have things like, for reasons unknown, um, time will tell, and labors left unfinished, and beyond all doubt. These things, like the for reasons unknown, kind of reflecting the uncertainty of human existence. Time will tell. Okay, so these are things that are repeated over and over again. Um, but in the end, what are we supposed to make of it? Well, Linda Bensby is, as I mentioned, a very prominent Beckett critic. And she is explaining here about, oops, sorry about that, talking about Beckett talking to a German actor who had played this part. Um, Beckett said that the first section describes, quote, the indifference of heaven, ending with the line, but not so fast. The second part, starting with considering what is more, is about, quote, man who is shrinking, about man who is dwindling. And the third fixes on the earth abode of stones, starting from the line, considering what is more, much more grave. So the monologue, according to Bensby, the monologue summarizes the position of the two tramps, Lucky, his master, and all people, condemned to shrink and decline on a dying earth under an indifferent sky. Wow, that sounds pretty pessimistic, eh? Um, I'm going to go back to the beginning of this section where it says, Lucky is freed of all expectations, but his monologue offers a composite of the philosophy that has brought him to his awareness. It is also a parody of human attempts to deny the human condition. Um, so, this performance is another attempt to articulate um, something about the nature of human existence. And it doesn't make sense. It's absurd. But again, once again, this is a play that is one of the foremost examples of the theater of the absurd. And so presenting the absurdity of existence is what it's trying to do. Okay, maybe that's enough about Lucky's monologue. If you were to go back and look at the text, you can kind of see what these three different sections look like. But I think if nothing else, we look at it as this is another performance in which there's an attempt to articulate something about the human condition. And I think this is significant for in the second act, because what happens in the second act is Pazzo and Lucky return, but one of them, Pazzo, is blind and Lucky is now dumb. We'll talk about the significance of that a little bit later. All right, so let's talk a little bit now about Act Two. I should mention that it was, I think, the first performance of this play in London. A number of people walked out because they thought they were just starting again at the beginning and going to doing the first act all over again. But that's not exactly true. But you might have been impressed by the fact that there's a lot of repetition, or repetition of similar kinds of actions. There's another famous critic, and I'm trying to remember which one it is now. I think it might be Martin Esplin, who said of this play that its most distinguishing characteristic trait is that it's the only play that he knew in which nothing happened twice. So that's always good for a laugh. But yeah, it's true. Nothing, the thing that's supposed to happen does not happen. And then we have Act Two take place, in which that thing is supposed to happen again, the coming of Godot, and it does not. So I developed this slide, as a visual to sort of demonstrate how Act One, which we have up here, really in many ways is structured exactly the same in Act Two. It's not that everything is repeated, um, but the same types of things happen in both acts. We could go even further and say, like, before each of the two acts, we hear about Gogo getting beaten, during the night. Dee Dee and Gogo separate in the evening, apparently, and then they come again back together the next day. But in both cases, we hear about Gogo having gotten beaten by people, and Dee Dee says, "Who? By who? How many?" And Gogo doesn't even know. Um, so then, in each of the acts, Dee Dee and Gogo are on stage the entire time, except for brief moments when, like, Dee Dee runs off stage when he has to urinate, and I think both of them run off stage briefly during Lucky's monologue. But they're essentially on the stage the entire time, and then at some point, right around the same point in each act, Patso and Lucky show up, and then they do whatever they do, and Dee Dee and Gogo are entertained, I guess, in a way. And then when they shortly after they leave, the boy comes to announce that Godot is not going to come. I think it's significant too that at each time in both Act One and Act Two, after Patso and Lucky leave the stage, Dee Dee repeats the phrase, "Well, that passed the time." In Act One, it's a little bit more comical because then Gogo said it would have passed anyway. Um, and then Dee Dee says, "Yes, but not so rapidly." All right, so this the structure here kind of represents something I talked about earlier in another video about how one of the possible interpretations of this play is that it is about the passing of time and how waiting for something slows down time. So you have in the first part of each of the acts, what are they doing? We hear about Dee Dee's trying to get Gogo to remember something, and he doesn't remember. He refuses to accept that something about that Dee Dee's trying to get him to remember. We have a bit with a carrot or a radish. They're passing time. They're playing games. They play games of asking questions, or say things. That's the idea. Let's abuse each other, or that's the idea. Let's ask each other questions. In both acts, they talk about the tree. In both acts, they talk about hanging themselves from that tree. In both acts, they do that thing I talked about last time. The hat and the boots. Gogo's feet are always hurting him, and he's always talking about it. And then Dee Dee is playing with his hat. In Act Two, there's a funny, exchange of hat, sort of slapstick kind of a gag that they do. But and then in each act, Gogo sleeps at one point, and then they do the thing where Dee Dee wakes him up, and then Gogo starts telling him his dream. He says, "Don't tell me," and we never really find out why. But there's that repetition of these various activities that is, I think, suggesting that what Dee Dee and Gogo are doing is filling the time until either Godot comes or night comes, and so they can stop waiting for another day. The one significant difference here is that when Patso and Lucky come, they do not do the same thing. We learn now that they are blind and dumb, and so now I want to return to that question. And I don't always know exactly how to phrase this, but I think it's a question of, is it possible that they have been, if there is some other kind of divine being, have they perhaps been being punished for attempting to articulate the human condition in those three performances in Act One? When we never know, but there's another big question here of time. Um, and this is something that I'm going to be asking you to write about in the on the question and answer discussion board, having to do with there is a question in Act Two about whether or not this is the next day. Dee Dee says, it was yesterday that they saw Patso and Lucky. It was yesterday that they were talking about hanging themselves from the tree. And Gogo says, all that was yesterday? And he refuses to accept that. And also there's a question of, there are some leaves on the tree now. And Dee Dee says, how can that be if it was bare yesterday, now there are leaves on the tree over one night? And Gogo says, you made that up. He refuses to accept that it's the same, that it's the day after their previous meeting. And it becomes an issue too with Patso and Lucky, because Patso is blind, and they say, well, how long was it? If it was just yesterday that we saw you, and he says, oh, I don't remember when I went blind. I have no idea of the sense of time. So I'm going to be asking you a question about that, and ask you to respond on the discussion board for your participation this week. And I will be posting, one more lecture video, if you want to call it that, sometime by Thursday's class. Okay, see you next time.